So, when you are anticipating a presentation that is on the perspectives of debt, monetary policy, economic growth, and inflation, you might think that you're in for a snooze fest. All right, good. Well, because the reality is this that is not at all the case. This title belies the true excitement of the material that's about to be at hand. Because when our team had the opportunity to speak with Dr. Dan Thornton, we were blown away by this gentleman's passion and just deep understanding of what is happening in the current economic climate. And when he talks to you about what's happening in today's financial environment and tells you about how that's going to matter to you as a person and in your financial institutions, I promise you he will have you at the edge of your seat. Dr. Dan Thornton holds a PhD in economics, and he is a former economic advisor and vice president of the St. Louis Federal Reserve Bank. So I will ask you to join me in welcoming Dr. Dan Thornton to the stage.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me here. One thing I won't tell you is how it's going to impact you, okay? I'm just going to tell you a few things. So what I picked were things that I think really are important that people know the difference and understand. So that's what we're kind of going to do. All right, so we have two debt measures, right? And I think it's really important to know the difference. So here they are. So the red line is the federal debt held by the public. That's the real one. The top blue line is the debt held by the public plus the trust fund. This accounting gimmick that doesn't exist, it's an accounting gimmick. And so what they're predicting now, I guess, is about 2035, those two lines are going to convert, right? Because we're going to have overspend in those other areas. We're already doing Social Security. So, for example, before about 2010, 2011, Social Security income taxes, right, exceeded expenditures. That flipped around 2011, right? So right now we're drawing down the Social Security trust fund, right? So the bottom one is the one you want to pay attention to, and right now it's about 23 trillion, something like that, in that neighborhood. And if some people in government have the way, it's going to take a huge jump, right? A massive jump. All right, why did we have the problem? When did it start? So this right here is about 1970. And you see, this is the federal surplus of deficit. This is the deficit if you're on the negative side of that, right? And you see, basically around 70, we started running deficit. That little 4 years there where it pops up, that's Clinton, the last fiscally conservative president we've had, and he wasn't fiscally conservative forever. This is the same thing as a percent of GDP. So you see, no matter how you cut it, slice it, dice it, people like to present as debt as a measure as a percent of GDP, but it's basically the same story. Okay? So why did this happen? Well, very simple reason. So this is the debt. This is federal income and outlays going back to 1930. We had the Great Depression. We had World War II. And then we kind of behaved ourselves. Right? We were kind of spending what we brought in, and we were being very nice and fiscally responsible, and then we started being fiscally unresponsible. So about, again, right around 70, right? Red line, you get a little bit of this blue line, right? We know when that happened. And now we're off to the races, and basically, God only knows where this is going to end. I have no idea. Can we increase debt with impunity? Well, there's a group called the Modern Monetary Theory that believes that we can have debt with impunity. We're never going to have to pay off the debt. That's correct. We never have. Right? We go back here. We never paid it off. It just keeps getting bigger. right? We are never going to pay off the debt. So they're correct that that's true. Oh, why did I use that? Oh. But the Federal Reserve has kind of helped finance it. So what I want to get to is I'm going to talk about what can happen. How can we get to a situation where we're going to have a debt default? Right? In the United States, we think of a debt default. That's never, ever possibly going to happen to us. Wrong. It can. We're not immune to that. So what I'm trying to get at is, when did this happen? Well, right now, we got the Federal Reserve, of course. It was mentioned by a previous speaker. The Federal Reserve is competing with you guys, right? Buying this debt. So how much debt? Here's what the Federal Reserve holding the debt looks like. So you see, going all the way up to about 2007, and then it fell down, actually. So this is actually 2007 in the early days when the financial crisis was going on, and it started in August of 2007, but the Fed wasn't really doing anything, all right? We made a few loans to banks with something called the term auction facility, all right? And basically what we're doing is we're sterilizing the effect of that, right, on reserves. So reserves weren't increasing. So on one hand, we're lending to banks, and the other hand, we're selling securities. All right? So what happens is if we lend banks, they get reserves. If we sell securities, we take the reserves out of the system, and we're keeping reserves neutral by doing that. Okay? Then what happened is something called Lehman Brothers. Right? On September 15th of 2008, Lehman Brothers said, we're bankrupt. Right? And then, you know what hit the fan? Right? Everything. So we started making massive loans. And when we started making massive loans, this initially loaned. Right? That little flip there. Basically making loans. And then the Fed under Bernanke decided that we had to move into a new regime called quantitative easing. Right? So I can tell you that when they started this, they didn't have a theory. Right? They did this just saying, well, it's going to work. They had no theory. Actually, they started this in, the first time was when the Board of Governors did this on their own on November 25th of 08, where they announced they were going to buy about $600 billion, mostly in MBS, mortgage-backed securities. And then the big time was in the March meeting in 2009, when we really got, they were going to buy an additional $1.15 trillion of long-term treasuries, agency debt, and MBS. Right? So they didn't have a theory. Right? There was no theory. The theory came around 2010 by some board staffers, put together a theory of how this is going to work and how it was going to lower long-term rates. Turns out, it was all wrong. All right? I can't go into the details there because we'd be here a long time. But I can guarantee you it was BS. All right? It was wrong. So what did we do? Well, we kept on doing it. So right now, we hold about, it's actually, I think, around, well, here it says about $5.5 trillion. I think it's a little higher than that now. I think it's a little higher than that now. All right? So these are annual data as of 2020 at the end of this. I don't do anything beyond 2020 because of the COVID. So all the data's messed up after 2020. I mean, you just don't want to do that. Okay? So who owns the debt? Well, we own 25% of that real debt, marketable stuff. Foreigners own about 30, I guess 3% or so. So Most of the debt that's a big chunk of debt we're holding, right? Um, and a big chunk of debt the foreign governments are holding. Although that's relatively immaterial, but basically over 55% of the debt is being held by the Fed and foreigners right now. So basically, the policy supported a large debt. So what you have to know is what happens, how the Fed works. All right, so the Fed makes money off our portfolio. That's always how the Fed gets income. They spend whatever they think they need to spend and whatever Congress approves that they spend. And then the difference between that, they rebate back to the Treasury. So if you want to know a firm, an organization that's really undercapitalized, it's the Federal Reserve. We have essentially no, for all intents and purposes, absolutely no capital. None, zero. We are worse than Freddie and Fannie, which had almost no capital. All right, so we're much worse than those. Basically, so far, since QE began, we have rebated basically about $900 billion, right? A little over $900 billion to the Treasury. So that's made the national debt about $900 billion lower than it really would be. If somebody else was buying this debt, not us, right? The debt would be about almost $1 trillion larger right now, and it won't be long and that number will hit $1 trillion. The Fed can also reduce the interest cost of the debt, right? Because we are buying it, right? And so the interest is being paid to us, and we're just doing what? We're just giving it back. So the interest cost, the service cost of the debt is the key factor, right, in whether or not we will ever have a default. So it's not the size of the debt, it's not the size of the debt relative to GDP, it's the size of the debt service relative to GDP. All right, so here's debt service. These are in dollars. All right, so right now it's about 300, it's that axis, it's about 350 billion a year in 2020 was the debt service. We're just, before you do anything else, you're spending 320 billion just to service your debt. All right. Oh, I put the interest rate on here because I want to show you how the interest income can impact that. All right. Look, debt service, we weren't really running up the debt hugely yet, but the interest rates were high, so the debt service was increasing. Right? Now interest rates are going down, we're having massive, right? And it's slowing down, but if you buy enough, so this is it relative to GDP. 10-year Treasury rates, the red guy again. This is debt service relative to GDP. Right now, 2020, it was a little over 1.5%. Right? Peaked in my data, peaked right here about a little over 3% of GDP. Right? A little over 3. So the question is, how big does that number have to get before people start getting a little antsy? Right? So this is what I call the anatomy of a U.S. default. Right? So if a default's going to happen, this is kind of my view of kind of how it will evolve. Right? So you get your debt service, let's say 5 or 6% of GDP. That's probably high enough to make investors a little nervous now, especially maybe foreign investors, which own 30-some% of the debt. If economic growth is slow, right, that'll be a contributing factor because it's one thing if you have 5 or 6%, but you're having 3% or 4% growth, right? They have a lot of growth, maybe it's 4 or 5%, 5 or 6% is not that bad. If you're having 1.5, 2% growth, and I'll show you that's what I think we'll have, somewhere in that name, that might make people a lot more nervous. It would also make nervous if interest rates are relatively high, let's say because of inflation. Right? Inflation does two things, right? This is the way countries, small countries, used to get out of a debt crisis. They'd inflate the way out. Right? So you run up the inflation rate, and now your debt, your real debt, goes down, but your service costs go up. So it's kind of a double-edged sword. On one hand, you get kind of a little benefit. The other hand, you're taking it away. So basically, if that's where to start, what will happen is people will start getting a little antsy. I don't know. So what do? They start requiring a little higher interest rate, right? They're going to give you a little lower price for your bonds now than they were before, right? And your interest rate's going to go up. Well, what happens if interest rates go up? Your debt service goes up. So you could get this vicious cycle going, right? This is exactly what happened to Greece, by the way. This is actually, well, it's almost every debt default in history has gone this way, right? And even though we're the biggest country, we're the strongest country, we have the advantage that we are big and we are strong. So it'll be harder for us to get a default.